Hey guys, tonight we wander into the golden haze of Paris in the 1890s, a city that glows with lamplight, clatters with horse-drawn carriages, and hums with the footsteps of countless night owls chasing distraction. Imagine yourself standing on the cobbled stones of the Boulevard Saint-Germain just as the sun drops away, the sky bruising into twilight purple. The cafés lining the street burst into light, spilling laughter, cigarette smoke, and the occasional clink of glass out onto the sidewalk. A faint, licorice sweet aroma drifts in the air. That would be absinthe, the drink everyone's whispering about, praised as a muse and damned as a poison. You might even feel the tug of curiosity to try it. Though, let's be real, you probably won't survive the hangover if you dive in as recklessly as these Parisians. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you're awake and listening. Tell me your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where in the world this sleepy history finds you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge further into the heart of the city, following the clusters of people streaming toward their favorite cafes. Tables stretch across the sidewalks, candles flickering in little glass holders, waiters darting between them with trays piled high with drinks. You hear a name tossed around in hushed tones, La Fée Verte, the Green Fairy. It's a nickname. That gives the drink an air of enchantment, as though what rests in those tall glasses isn't mere alcohol, but a spirit that dances between reality and dream. Historians still argue whether that phrase was born from genuine hallucinations or clever marketing, but either way, it sticks, fluttering from one Parisian tongue to the next. The Paris of the 1890s is not just a city, it's a stage. Haussmanns. Grand boulevards gleam with rows of uniform buildings, every corner boasting a café, cabaret, or theatre. In the distance, you can almost hear the echo of can-can music spilling out of the Moulin Rouge. But tonight, you're here to linger with the quieter crowd, the one that pulls up a chair, orders absinthe, and waits for the world to blur just. Slightly at the edges, you watch as a waiter sets down a carafe of cold water, a silver spoon, and a glass containing a pale green liquid. The ritual has just begun. Though it looks like a performance, it's simply the way Parisians take their absinthe, an almost ceremonial slow drip of water over a sugar cube, dissolving it into the drink, which turns from emerald clear to a milky opalescent cloud. It's strangely hypnotic, like watching ink spread in water. A quirky tidbit here. Some cafes even hired people just to drip water steadily into glasses, a little job title you'd never guess existed in the 1890s, professional water dripper. Of course, Paris has always loved a ritual. Coffee, wine, brandy, they all had their place. But absinthe held a particular magnetism, partly because it seemed exotic. Wormwood, its defining ingredient, carried the whiff of ancient medicine, something herbal and mystical, and the high alcohol content added a dangerous thrill. By now, you notice clusters of bohemians, painters with messy hair, poets who look like they haven't slept in days, huddled over their glasses, claiming the Green Fairy stirs their creativity. You can't help but smirk. Maybe it does, or maybe it just lowers the bar enough that scribbling in the margins feels profound. As you continue along the boulevard, you catch snippets of conversation that sound almost like advertisements. Claims of visions, inspiration, escape. Some swear they see colors more brightly, or ideas arrive with supernatural clarity. Others just slouch and laugh louder than usual. Historians still argue whether absinthe truly created hallucinations or whether the combination of high-proof alcohol and suggestive culture made people believe they were seeing green fairies dancing in candlelight. Either way, the legend is growing right before your eyes. The mainstream fact everyone in Paris seems to know. Absinthe consumption is climbing fast. By the end of the century, it's estimated the French drink 2 million liters of the stuff annually. It's not just a drink, it's a movement, threading its way into art, politics, and even daily routine. The bourgeoisie sip it in well-lit cafes, the working class knock it back in smoky bars, and the artists romanticize it in garrets and studios. One drink, so many worlds converging. But here's the quirkier side, the timing of your stroll. 6. A clock sharp is known as l'heure verte, the green hour, when cafés across Paris fill with patrons ordering their first glass of the evening. You'd think happy hour was a 20th century marketing gimmick, but no, 1890s Paris beat modern. Pubs to the punch, complete with its own catchy phrase. By now, as you pass one café after another, you notice how synchronized the city feels. Thousands of people raising identical cloudy glasses at roughly the same time, as if obeying an invisible conductor. The sensory details pile up. The sweet. Anise scent of absinthe wafts through the air, mingling with cigarette smoke and the earthy tang of roasting chestnuts sold by street vendors. You hear the scrape of chairs, the clink of metal spoons, the occasional shattering of a dropped glass that earns a round of laughter. A stray dog noses around tables for scraps while a child darts between chairs delivering newspapers. Somewhere, down the street, a barrel organ wheezes out a jaunty tune, and you wonder if this city ever actually sleeps. You probably wouldn't last a week if you tried keeping up with these Parisians, between the drinking, the late nights, and the questionable hygiene. Still, there's something magnetic about it all. The warm glow of café lamps, the swirl of conversation in French, German, English, even Russian. Paris is an international hub, and absinthe is becoming its shared language. Before long, you realize you've drifted into the rhythm of the city itself. Step, laugh, clink, sip. The boulevard feels like a heartbeat, and you, glass in hand, are part of it. The green fairy may just be a metaphor, but tonight she feels very real, hovering in the smoky glow, coaxing the city deeper into its twilight dreams. You don't have to walk far before the whisper becomes a chorus. The green fairy, always the green fairy. The nickname clings to absinthe with such persistence that it seems less like a metaphor and more like a character in the city's unfolding drama. By now, you're sitting at a small marble table, a wrought iron chair pressing into your back, and the glass before you glows faintly in the lamplight. You swirl it once, watching the liquid shift from emerald to cloudy pearl. It feels theatrical, as if the drink itself is winking, daring you to believe in its magic. The allure is more than taste, it's image. Absinthe looks different, carries itself differently. Compared to the deep ruby wines or golden beers, here is a shimmering green spirit that seems almost radioactive in the flicker of gas lamps. Parisians joke that it's like sipping bottled springtime, and you almost believe them. That brightness, against the drab backdrop of industrial Paris, makes it irresistible, especially for artists hunting metaphors to splash across canvas or stanza. Historians still argue whether the color association was consciously marketed or simply an accident of chemistry, but the fact remains, green became synonymous with both inspiration and danger. A mainstream fact slides in here. By the 1890s, absinthe was among the most popular aperitifs in France, consumed widely before dinner to awaken the appetite. It wasn't niche, it was fashionable. Middle-class clerks and shopkeepers adopted it as readily as poets and painters, making the fairy less bohemian muse and more cultural phenomenon. Some scholars call it the champagne of the people, but it's not just Paris that talks. Rumors ripple through Europe, Switzerland, Belgium, even parts of Spain. Absinthe spreads across borders, carried by travelers who marvel at both its beauty and its danger. A quirky tidbit. Swiss villagers nicknamed it La Bleue, the blue one, because their homemade batches sometimes turned more sky-tinted than green. So already the fairy has multiple disguises, depending on which border she crosses. You take another slow sip and let the anise flavor coat your tongue. It's sharp, yet sweet, with an herbal bitterness that lingers. It's not the easiest taste, but that's part of its charm. It feels like a secret handshake, a signal that you're part of a club that tolerates a little bite in exchange for belonging. The green fairy works as a social lubricant, coaxing strangers into conversation and artists into midnight rants. Even the most respectable bourgeois matron can lean into her glass and excuse a lapse in manners by blaming the mischievous spirit. The allure also lies in contradiction. Absinthe is marketed as both medicine and menace. Pharmacists once sold it as a tonic for digestion, headaches, even worms. Yet the press increasingly paints it as dangerous, a temptation that leads to ruin. You can't help but smirk at the paradox. The same liquid prescribed by doctors is condemned by moralists. Historians still argue whether this double identity helped the fairy thrive. After all, nothing attracts attention quite like forbidden fruit that also claims to cure your indigestion. Paris thrives on gossip, and absinthe gives people plenty to whisper about. A clerk is said to have written the next day's office ledgers with startling creativity after 2 glasses. A cabaret singer swears the fairy makes her voice soar an octave higher. A painter in Montmartre insists he sees brushstrokes glow more vividly when he drinks. Are they exaggerating? Almost certainly. But as you sip, you realize the stories themselves are part of the intoxication. People want to believe. The green fairy can elevate them, make them sharper, braver, funnier. It's not just about drinking, it's about joining a mythology. Take a moment to glance at the street around you. Posters already hint at the fairy's celebrity. Lithographs plastered on walls showing a glowing woman in green robes offering a chalice. They blur the line between product and spirit, convincing you that what's in your glass has more agency than mere alcohol. Even if you know it's a clever illusion, you feel the pull. The fairy becomes a companion, a muse, a scapegoat. When you succeed, you thank her. When you fail, you blame her. Not bad for a drink that costs less than dinner. And here comes a little joke to keep you awake. If coffee makes you productive and wine makes you chatty, absinthe apparently makes you convinced you're the next Victor Hugo, even if all you've done is doodle in the margins of yesterday's grocery list. The fairy has a knack for stroking egos, whether or not she delivers results. The deeper you watch, the more you see how seamlessly the fairy infiltrates daily life. 6 o'clock strikes, and the clinking ritual begins again. Water dripping over. Sugar cubes, glasses clouding, conversations rising. The drink doesn't just fit into Parisian routine, it creates one. There's comfort in its predictability, yet always the thrill that tonight the fairy might show you something extraordinary. And so you sit a little longer, glass in hand, trying to decide, is this enchantment real or just suggestion? Historians still argue whether absinthe's effects were exaggerated by culture, whether people truly saw visions or merely acted out expectations. But in this moment, you don't need a scholarly verdict. You simply feel the pull of the fairy. Delicate, yet insistent as she beckons you deeper into the night. The café is where Paris breathes. You step into one now, brushing past a velvet curtain, and find yourself in a space so alive it almost hums. Smoke coils in lazy spirals toward a ceiling painted with peeling gold leaf, the air vibrating with chatter and the occasional clang of cutlery. At every table, glasses of absinthe glimmer like jewels under gaslight. Each clouded swirl a tiny performance. The café culture of 1890s Paris isn't just about food or drink. It's about belonging to a spectacle, one where everyone has a role to play. You sink into a chair, iron legs scraping tile, and look around. At the next table, a painter sketches furiously on scraps of paper, one knee bouncing with nervous energy. Across the room, 2 women lean close, their laughter cutting through the din. Behind you, a journalist scribbles headlines for tomorrow's paper, pausing only to lift his glass in a toast no one asked for. This is the magic of Paris cafés. Poets, artists, clerks, and tourists all stacked together, elbow to elbow, as if status and class dissolve in a haze of cigarette smoke and anise. A mainstream fact. By the 1890s, Paris boasted more than 30,000 altitudes, cafés, each with its own atmosphere, clientele, and reputation. Some were elegant, suited for bourgeois society. Others were dingy, the haunts of dock workers and students. Absinthe flowed in both. It wasn't confined to one circle, but stretched across the city's entire social spectrum, like a green thread stitching disparate lives into the same tapestry. Here's a quirky tidbit. Many cafés charged not for the drink itself, but for the water service that accompanied it. The waiter would bring a carafe of chilled water, ice clinking inside, and you'd pay for the privilege of slowly diluting your absinthe until it blossomed into that milky cloud. Imagine that, paying for water, not alcohol. If you've ever Bought overpriced bottled water at an airport? Congratulations, you've accidentally relived a 19th century Parisian tradition. The café ritual goes beyond sipping. It's about observing, listening, performing. People linger for hours, their tables cluttered with glasses, ashtrays, and discarded sugar wrappers. Musicians sometimes drift through with violins, playing short melodies for coins. Waiters weave expertly between chairs, balancing trays with a grace that borders on choreography. And over it all hangs the ever-present sense that something important might happen here. A debate, an argument, a moment of inspiration that shifts culture ever so slightly. You catch a snippet of gossip. Someone claims that Paul Verlaine, the poet, was spotted at a café down the street last night, rambling about angels after one too many glasses. Another swears Toulouse-Lautrec was sketching drunk patrons at the Moulin Rouge. The café is a stage, and the patrons are its actors, all convinced that the Green Fairy has chosen their performance as tonight's highlight. Historians still argue whether café culture truly democratized Parisian life or simply created the illusion of equality. After all, the wealthy could afford better seats, finer food, and more refined company. But there's no denying that cafés blurred boundaries. A shop clerk might find himself arguing with a well-known critic. A factory worker could overhear philosophical debates from students at the next table. The walls of status softened, if only for the length of a glass. The soundscape is rich, chairs scraping, spoons tapping against glass, bursts of laughter, the occasional sharp "Monsieur!" as someone tries to flag a waiter. Outside, the city clatters on. Hooves on cobblestones, a newspaper boy shouting headlines, the distant rattle of a tram. Inside, though, time bends. Hours slip by unnoticed, measured only by the number of glasses, clouding on the table. You lean back, glass in hand, and realize how integral cafés are to the Parisian identity. Without them, the city would lose its pulse. Imagine Paris without its cafés, like Venice drained of canals, or New York without yellow taxis. It would simply collapse under its own silence. Another joke to keep you awake. If you've ever tried to work in a coffee shop with your laptop and felt smugly artistic about it, congratulations again. You're basically a 19th century Parisian, just with Wi-Fi instead of wormwood. The vibe hasn't changed much, only the tools, the fairy herself, seems to thrive here. You notice how easily she slips from one table to the next, carried in glasses, whispered in stories, invoked in laughter. She isn't bound by glassware or recipe. She lives in the conversations, in the shared illusion that something magical could emerge at any moment, and when the hour grows late and the waiter begins stacking chairs, you notice the fairy's final trick. The conversations fade, the glass is empty, but the feeling lingers. People stumble home believing they were part of something larger, something ephemeral and enchanted. Tomorrow they'll return again, because cafes aren't just about sustenance. They're about being threaded into the fabric of Paris life. You step back into the night, the air cooler now, the stars faint above the haze of lamps. Somewhere down the street, another cafe hums just as loudly. And you realize the Green Fairy doesn't only live in the glass. She lives in the ritual, in the culture, in the endless rhythm of Paris cafes, beating like a second heart beneath the city. The glass before you is more than just a drink. It's a miniature performance. You've seen it by now. The absinthe spoon, a slender piece of metal with ornate cutouts, balanced across the rim of the glass. On top of it rests a sugar cube, pale and innocent-looking. A carafe of ice-cold water hovers, and then, with a slow pour, the ritual begins. Drop by drop, the water drips through the sugar, dissolving into a stream that mingles with the green liquid below. At first, it's transparent emerald. Then, as the water swirls, the fairy reveals her true form, a cloudy opalescence, shifting, and alive like a storm rolling through glass. The ritual itself is mesmerizing. The French call this transformation the louche, a word that literally means cloudy, though it carries connotations of something shady, even suspicious. And really, what better word could exist for a drink surrounded by whispers of visions, madness, and scandal? Watching the louche feels almost hypnotic. People lean in, eyes following every swirl, as though hoping to glimpse a secret message in the milky fog. It's not just chemistry, it's theater. Absinthe cafés build identity around this ritual, encouraging patrons to linger, to take their time. You don't just drink absinthe, you court it. Water dripping slowly, sugar melting sweetly, glass changing color, it all turns consumption into ceremony. Historians still argue whether the ritual was born from necessity, to dilute a brutally strong alcohol, or from clever marketing. But by the 1890s, it had become inseparable from the fairies' legend. The ritual itself is mesmerizing. The French call this transformation the louche, a word that literally means cloudy, though it carries connotations of something shady, even suspicious. And really, what better word could exist for a drink, surrounded by whispers of visions, madness, and scandal? Watching the louche feels almost hypnotic. People lean in, eyes following every swirl, as though hoping to glimpse a secret message in the milky fog. It's not just chemistry, it's theater. Absinthe cafes build identity around this ritual, encouraging patrons to linger, to take their time. You don't just drink absinthe, you court it. Water dripping slowly, sugar melting sweetly, glass changing color, it all turns consumption into ceremony. Historians still argue whether the ritual was born from necessity to dilute a brutally strong alcohol or from clever marketing, but by the 1890s it had become inseparable from the fairies' legend. A mainstream fact worth noting. Absinthe at the time often contained upwards of 70% alcohol before dilution. Straight shots would flatten most mortals, so watering it down wasn't just cultural flair, it was survival. The ritual, in its practicality, kept people upright long enough to order another. But here's a quirky tidbit for you. Absinthe spoons became so elaborate and decorative that they turned into collector's items. Some were shaped like leaves, others like Eiffel Towers, even crosses. Wealthier drinkers carried their own engraved spoons to cafes, almost like flashing a personalized VIP pass. Imagine strolling into Starbucks today with your own monogrammed latte stirrer. It's the same energy, only shinier. The cafe around you glows with this collective choreography. Tables sparkle with rows of glasses, spoons balanced neatly across rims, sugar cubes like tiny stage props waiting to dissolve. Water drips rhythmically, a sound that blends with the low hum of conversation. Every table is a miniature laboratory, every drinker a chemist of indulgence. The fairy doesn't just intoxicate, she enchants, weaving ritual into routine until it feels sacred. Of course, not everyone approves. Moral critics complain that this slow ritual encourages idleness, wasting time better spent working or praying. They see the fairies' theatre as a symptom of decadence, a society too lazy to resist temptation. But for the Parisians, that's the point. Life moves fast outside, trams rattling, factories roaring, carriages jostling. Inside the cafe, time slows. The ritual forces you to pause, to watch, to savor. Historians still argue whether this ritual is why absinthe spread so widely across classes. For the poor, it turned a cheap glass of alcohol into an event, a luxury that felt extravagant. For the wealthy, it provided sophistication, a chance to perform refinement in front of peers. Either way, the fairies' allure isn't just chemical, it's social. You try the ritual yourself, clumsily at first, spilling a little water on the table. The sugar cube dissolves, collapsing into syrup that swirls into the green. Slowly, the clear liquor grows opaque, until the glass resembles frosted jade. You lift it, take a sip, and realize why the ritual matters. The sweetness softens the bite, the water lifts the aroma, and suddenly the drink is balanced, sharp yet delicate, bitter yet soothing. It feels less like a punch to the gut and more like a gentle nudge toward dreaminess. A little joke sneaks in here. The ritual takes so long that you half expect someone to invent a shortcut, a microwave absinthe for the impatient. But no, the fairy refuses to be rushed. If you want her, you wait. As the evening deepens, the cafe grows louder. A group of students at one table debate politics with too much confidence and too little evidence. At another, two painters argue over whether blue or red conveys madness more effectively. And everywhere, glasses glow with that same cloudy swirl, the fairy inhabiting each sip. The ritual ties them all together. It doesn't matter if you're a shoemaker or a writer, everyone must wait, watch, sip. The shared slowness becomes a communal rhythm, the fairy herself conducting the city's after-hours symphony. You realize that Paris doesn't just drink absinthe. It performs it night after night until the ritual itself becomes as famous as the drink. And as you lean back, glass in hand, you understand why. The fairy isn't only in the flavor or the effects, she's in the patience, the anticipation, the moment when cloudy green finally yields to your lips. Without the ritual, she's just liquor. With it, she's legend. The night air outside still smells faintly of anise and smoke as you drift through the streets, overhearing the latest rumors swirling around Paris. You've barely settled at another café table when someone mentions Vincent van Gogh. His name carries both awe and unease, as if saying it too loudly might summon the tragedy attached to it. The story comes out in a hushed rush. A painter, brilliant but unhinged, who drank absinthe until it drove him to madness. Some swear it was the green fairy herself that whispered in his ear before he sliced off his own. Whether true or exaggerated, the tale lingers in the air like smoke from a Gauloise's cigarette. You sip your cloudy drink and consider how tightly the fairy's reputation is tied to artists and their misfortunes. Van Gogh becomes a symbol here, not just for creativity, but for its cost. His vibrant yellows and swirling blues seem almost born from intoxication, as though the fairy tilted the world and poured color straight onto his canvases. Historians still argue whether absinthe truly influenced his art or whether the connection was stitched together after his breakdown. But in Paris of the 1890s, the legend has already taken hold. Drink absinthe, gain genius, risk madness. The mainstream. Fact is this: Van Gogh wasn't the only one. His contemporaries, Paul Gauguin, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and even later, Pablo Picasso, were all linked in some way to the green fairy. Some drank it daily, others only occasionally, but all left behind paintings that captured its glow. Degas painted women slumped over their glasses. Manet sketched friends in absinthe cafés. The fairy isn't just an idea floating in the city, it's immortalized in oil and pastel, a muse made permanent. A quirky tidbit surfaces in your wandering thoughts. Toulouse-Lautrec, short in stature and perpetually inventive, once carried a hollowed-out cane filled with absinthe. Yes, a literal absinthe cane. At any moment, he could unscrew the top and pour himself a secret drink. Forget hip flasks. Parisian artists were apparently walking around with weaponized cocktails disguised as fashion accessories. The green fairy inspires ingenuity, if nothing else. The more you listen, the more the conversation drifts toward the darker side of the myth. Absinthe is blamed for hallucinations, violent tempers, and reckless acts. One patron insists that after 2 glasses, colors literally hum and shadows stretch unnaturally across the walls. Another claims that people under the fairy's spell lose all sense of self, dissolving into madness. Historians still argue whether these stories are just drunken exaggerations or if Wormwood's chemical thujone really had some effect on the brain. Either way, the narrative sticks. You lean back and glance at the artwork pinned to cafe walls. Posters glow with fantastical depictions of absinthe, a green woman perched on a glass rim, a fairy whispering into the ear of a dazed drinker, a bottle sparkling like treasure. It's no wonder people imagine the drink has supernatural power. Advertisers practically gift-wrap the illusion. The fairy, though, has a sly trick. She allows people to blame her for their worst impulses. A broken friendship. The fairy's fault, a night of debauchery. Blame her whispers, an ear cut off in the depths of despair. Surely the fairy made him do it. It's oddly comforting, isn't it, to shift responsibility from human weakness to a mischievous spirit in a glass. Another light joke slips in here. If you've ever woken up regretting a 2 a.m. text, imagine explaining it to your friends by saying, "The green fairy made me do it." Parisian excuse culture was thriving long before smartphones. Still, there's a fascination with the idea that creativity and madness share the same tightrope, and absinthe is the balancing pole. Drink enough, and you might see visions worth painting. Drink too much, and you tumble headlong into chaos. the fairy offers brilliance and ruin in the same sip, and that paradox keeps the artists and their audiences captivated. The café grows louder, voices overlapping into a buzzing symphony of speculation and storytelling. Yet beneath it all is the same undercurrent: fear and fascination. You sense that Parisians aren't just drinking a beverage, they're courting a myth, daring to touch genius while hoping madness doesn't follow. When you leave the café at last, the night feels sharper, more electric. Street lamps cast halos in the mist, and you wonder if Van Gogh once walked these very roads, seeing light fracture and colours shimmer under the fairy's influence. Maybe it wasn't madness at all. Maybe it was simply seeing the world through the green haze of Paris. In the 1890s. By now you've caught on that absinthe isn't just a drink, it's a battlefield, not between drunk poets and stern moralists, though that comes later, but between two powerful industries locked in a tug-of-war, the absinthe makers and the French wine producers. You take your seat at another café, the sugar cube poised, and overhear the latest mutterings. The vintners are furious. Here's the mainstream fact. Throughout the 19th century, France's wine industry suffered catastrophes. Chief among them was the phylloxera plague of the 1860s, when tiny insects destroyed vineyards across the country. Wine production collapsed, prices soared, and suddenly absinthe, cheap to make, strong and fashionable, slid into the gap. By the 1890s, the fairy wasn't just a curiosity, she was a competitor, and the wine lobby, one of the most powerful in France, wasn't going to take that lying down. So the vintners launched a campaign of fear. Pamphlets circulated warning that absinthe turned men into lunatics, women into neglectful mothers, and children into criminals. Doctors with ties to the wine industry declared it poisonous, while sympathetic journalists printed lurid headlines about the absinthe scourge. Historians still argue whether the intensity of these campaigns came from genuine health concerns or sheer economic desperation. A quirky tidbit. One anti-absinthe poster depicted a skeleton in a green cloak pouring drinks, while a frightened French family cowered in the corner. Subtlety was not their strong suit. The message was clear. Drink wine, live a wholesome life. Drink absinthe, and the Grim Reaper sits at your table. Meanwhile, at the café, you notice that people shrug off these warnings. The green fairy is too alluring, and wine feels a bit boring in comparison. Absinthe rituals sparkle. Its colour mesmerizes, and its reputation, equal parts dangerous and chic, fits the restless energy of Paris. To sip wine was tradition. To sip absinthe was rebellion wrapped in glamour. You listen to two gentlemen arguing over their glasses. One insists that wine is the blood of France, sacred and eternal. The other laughs, pointing out that absinthe keeps the cafes full and the conversations lively. Around them, younger patrons seem firmly on the fairy's side. The fairy feels modern, progressive, a drink of the new century, while wine belongs to their parents. Here's where the humour creeps in. Imagine being a 19th century vintner, watching. Your elegant bottles gather dust while students flock to a glowing green drink that smells like licorice candy. It must have felt like losing a duel not to a rival knight, but to a clown with a sugar spoon. Still, the wine industry had influence in Parliament, and they wielded it fiercely. Petitions were filed, speeches made, statistics inflated. Absinthe, they argued, was not only an economic threat, but a national danger. France's strength came from its soldiers, workers, and farmers, and if they were drunk on wormwood instead of soberly sipping Bordeaux, what would become of the Republic? Historians still argue whether the wine lobby's crusade directly caused the eventual ban decades later, or whether they merely amplified fears already brewing. Either way, their fingerprints are everywhere in the growing hysteria. Each time a crime or scandal occurred, the press conveniently pointed out that absinthe had been involved. But here's the ironic twist. The harder the wine industry attacked, the more glamorous the fairy became. Nothing sells quite like the forbidden. For every pamphlet denouncing her, another poster went up showing her as a shimmering muse, a delicate fairy, whispering genius into the ear of a weary artist. You could almost say the vintners did half the marketing themselves. As the cafe buzzes, you sense the tension building. The fairy may still be free, but she's under siege. her glass gleaming like a banner in a war of drinks. Outside, vineyards slowly recover, their vines regaining strength. Inside, the fairy dances with patrons who laugh at the warnings, choosing inspiration and intoxication over tradition. By the end of the evening, you realize this rivalry is about more than beverages. It's about identity. Wine embodies the old France, rooted in soil, family, and ceremony. Absinthe embodies the new, urban, modern, unpredictable. And here you sit, sipping history in liquid form, caught between two worlds, clinking glasses in the smoky Paris night. You lean back in your chair, the glass cool in your hand, and start to wonder what exactly makes this green drink so infamous. The whispers of hallucinations, the claims of visions. Surely there must be something in the chemistry, right? You tilt your head and peer into the cloudy liquid, as though you might catch sight of the answer swirling among the sugar and anise. Here's the mainstream fact. Absinthe's distinctive bite comes from Artemisia absinthium, better known as wormwood. This bitter herb has been used for centuries in medicine, folk remedies, and even ancient rituals. What sets it apart is a compound called thujone, believed by many in the 19th century to cause everything from vivid hallucinations to full-blown insanity. Whether or not that's true, well, historians still argue about it. In 1890s Paris, though, science is as much theatre as the café rituals. Doctors and chemists line up to publish warnings. Some claim thujone overstimulates the nervous system, producing tremors, convulsions, and hallucinations. Others insist the real culprit is simply alcohol. After all, these glasses contain liquor strong enough to floor a horse even before the sugar and water are added. But the allure of a mystical ingredient is too good to ignore. Paris prefers its science with a dash of drama. A quirky tidbit floats to mind. In certain pharmacies, absinthe was sold in tiny doses as a remedy for stomach troubles, fevers, or even flatulence. That's right, the same drink blamed for madness was also prescribed for indigestion. If that's not the most 19th century contradiction ever, what is? You imagine a laboratory of the era. Glass beakers steaming, a chemist hunched over scales, trying to quantify the fairy herself. Numbers scribbled in notebooks, experiments that might or might not be accurate, but all delivered with confidence. The public eats it up. Newspapers gleefully report every alarming finding, printing illustrations of brains sizzling under the influence of wormwood. It's both science and sensationalism, shaken together like a cocktail. At your table, someone leans in to share his own testimony. He swears that after 2 glasses, the wallpaper in his flat began to ripple like waves on the Seine. Another nods knowingly and insists he once heard voices urging him to paint all night. Are these hallucinations or just drunken storytelling? Historians still argue whether thujone really produces such effects at the concentrations found in absinthe, or whether suggestion does most of the heavy lifting. After all, when everyone tells you the green fairy speaks, you're more likely to hear her. Here's a light joke to keep your eyelids from drooping. If modern energy drinks brag about extra caffeine, imagine absinthe labels boasting, now with 10% more hallucinations. It would have sold out in hours. The sensory side of wormwood is undeniable, though. Its bitterness cuts through the sweetness of sugar, giving absinthe its distinctive sharp edge. Without it, the drink would be just another sweet liqueur. Wormwood gives it character, a medicinal backbone, the suggestion that what you're drinking is not mere indulgence, but something powerful, even otherworldly. That suggestion alone is often enough to sway the imagination. You swirl your glass, watching the cloudy liquid catch the lamplight. Wormwood connects this moment to something ancient. The Greeks once steeped it into wine, the Romans used it in healing potions, and medieval apothecaries tucked it into remedies. Now, in 1890s Paris, it's the backbone of a cultural craze. You sip and wonder if humanity has always been just a little obsessed with finding magic in plants. The debate rages beyond cafes. Medical journals clash. One article swears absinthe is a neurotoxin, another claims it's no worse than brandy. Politicians seize on whichever argument suits their platform. And in the cafes themselves, the fairy keeps dancing, unconcerned, with data points. As you finish your glass, the world feels just slightly softer. the street lamps outside glowing with a faint halo. Is it the wormwood, or just your imagination primed by the stories? That's the trick, isn't it? You'll never quite know. And maybe that's the real power of the Green Fairy. She thrives in uncertainty, hovering in that liminal space between chemistry and folklore, where fact blurs seamlessly into fantasy. You slip into another cafe, this one smaller, warmer, tucked into a side street where the lamps flicker like candle stubs. Tonight, the crowd feels different. Instead of the usual pack of scruffy artists and loud students, you notice women. Some, elegant in high collars and feathered hats, others bold in looser dresses, laughing too freely for polite society. The fairy, it seems, is not only the companion of bohemians, but also the confidant of women, each one finding her own reflection in the green swirl. The mainstream fact is this. By the late 19th century, absinthe had crossed gender lines in ways other drinks rarely did. While wine and brandy were still framed as masculine indulgences, absinthe carved out space for women in the café scene. Writers of the time described les femmes à l'absinthe, women who dared to drink openly, sometimes alone, without hiding, behind the chaperones and conventions that usually bound them. In a city buzzing with whispers about independence and modernity, the fairy became part of the conversation about what women could or could not do. At the next table, a pair of well-dressed ladies sit with their glasses, sugar cubes dissolving in synchronized drips. One dabs her lips with a lace handkerchief between sips, while the other smirks, telling a story you can't quite catch, but that makes her companion laugh until her pearls rattle. You notice heads turn. Their presence still shocks some patrons, but it also fascinates them. Here are women asserting space in public, holding the same cloudy glasses as men. Historians still argue whether these moments truly represented liberation or whether society framed such women as scandalous exceptions. A quirky tidbit, absinthe cafes occasionally offered ladies' afternoons, hours where women could gather without male company, sipping their drinks beneath posters that promised refinement and sophistication. Some even advertised absinthe as slimming. Yes, the 19th century diet drink. Never mind the 70% alcohol content, apparently the fairy doubled as a personal trainer. The fairy slips easily into different disguises for women. For the respectable, she is a touch of elegance, something exotic to sip during conversation. For the rebellious, she is a badge of defiance, proof that they can laugh, linger, and indulge just as loudly as any man. For courtesans, she is both tool and ornament, giving their smoky salons an air of mystery and allure. The same liquid serves so many roles, adapting itself like a chameleon in green silk. You watch one woman at the bar sit alone, her posture confident, her gaze unwavering. It's a small rebellion, but in 1890s Paris it feels seismic. Drinking alone in public, unaccompanied, without shame, that's not just a glass of absinthe, that's a declaration. You wonder if she feels the fairy whispering courage in her ear, or if she's simply leaning on the excuse Paris already believes in. Blame it on the Green Fairy. Of course, critics notice. Moralists begin to blame absinthe for corrupting women, turning them from nurturing mothers into negligent drunkards. Pamphlets rail against absinthius, a term created specifically for female drinkers, dripping with judgment. Historians, still, argue whether these warnings reflected genuine fear for social order or were just another way of policing women's behavior. Either way, the fairy takes the blame once again. Here's a little joke to keep things light. In a world where women were told they shouldn't drink, smoke, or speak too loudly, the idea of them doing all three in one cafe must have given moral reformers the 19th century equivalent of a Twitter meltdown. The air in the cafe thickens with conversation. A group of young suffragists huddle over their glasses, whispering, "Plans." At another table, a chanteuse from the cabaret hums under her breath, her eyes glittering mischievously. The fairy seems especially lively tonight, weaving her green threads into women's laughter, courage, and defiance. As you step back into the street, the echoes follow you. Absinthe doesn't belong solely to painters or poets, it belongs to women too, reshaping how Paris sees them, challenging expectations with every glass raised. And somewhere in the shadows, the Green Fairy grins, pleased to have found yet another role to play in the restless theater of 1890s Paris. The street outside feels like a gallery before you even step inside. Every wall plastered with posters. shouting in bold colors. They're impossible to ignore. Glowing greens, fiery reds, outrageous yellows, each promising that one sip of absinthe could transport you into a world of elegance, artistry, or dangerous pleasure. You wander closer, tracing the outlines of wild-eyed women draped in flowing gowns, green smoke curling around them like spirits. If cafe rituals are theater, then the posters are the billboards, luring you into the show. The mainstream fact: the 1890s were the golden age of lithography, and Paris led the charge. Artists like Jules Chéret and later Alphonse Mucha transformed advertising into art, producing posters that were as collectible as paintings. Absinthe brands seized the trend with both hands. By the end of the decade, hundreds of different posters decorated the boulevards, turning the city into a constantly shifting canvas. You couldn't walk 5 steps without a fairy, a bottle, or a grinning patron beckoning from the wall. A quirky detail: competition between brands got so intense that some posters featured not the drink itself, but surreal mascots: a green devil, juggling bottles, or a fairy pouring absinthe into the open mouth of the moon. One ad even showed a cat staring hypnotically at a glass, as if absinthe had feline approval. Imagine your local bus stop plastered with soda ads featuring possessed house pets, and you'll get the vibe. The posters weren't just decoration. They were a language. For men, they promised virility, sophistication, or the spark of genius. For women, they dangled glamour and rebellion. For the masses, they simply whispered, "You belong in this cafe too." The fairy democratized her message, one brushstroke at a time. Historians still argue whether these posters reflected genuine enthusiasm or manufactured demand, but either way, Paris swallowed the imagery whole. You pause at one wall where an enormous lithograph stretches nearly door to door. It shows a glowing green fairy lifting her glass toward the viewer, smiling with just enough mischief to make you wonder what secrets she keeps. Above her, the word absinthe sprawls in letters that could be read from across the boulevard. The paint still smells fresh, like the wall itself is intoxicated. Inside cafes, miniature versions of these posters hang behind the bar, turning the decor into marketing. The repetition works. Even if you don't drink absinthe, you're surrounded by it, reminded that the fairy is everywhere, watching. This flood of imagery feels oddly modern, a 19th century version of scrolling through endless ads on your phone. The city itself becomes the feed, posters the algorithm, and absinthe the trending hashtag. Here's a light joke to keep you awake. If Paris had influencers back then, their posts would have been nothing but selfies with cloudy glasses and captions, like, "Green fairy vibes." Not everyone loves the flood of posters. Reformers call them dangerous temptations, claiming the images lure children into taverns. Landlords complain of walls being ruined by constant paste and paper. But the posters keep multiplying, because every cafe owner knows people drink with their eyes first. As you stroll further down the boulevard, you catch sight of an artist at work, pasting his latest creation while curious passers-by gather. His ladder wobbles slightly as he smooths the edges, but his concentration never wavers. You realize he's not just an advertiser, he's a street performer, turning the wall into a stage, the poster into spectacle. By the time you turn the corner, the fairy has followed you on every surface, smirking from posters, glowing in shop, windows lingering in your thoughts. The advertising barrage makes it clear. Absinthe isn't just a drink in Paris, it's an idea, a lifestyle, and the city has become its gallery. You wander into a square where the laughter feels thinner, the air heavier. The crowd here isn't filled with artists or dreamers, but with men in stiff collars, women clutching prayer books, and a preacher on a wooden crate railing about morality. His voice cracks through the night, warning that absinthe is not a drink but a poison, not a pastime but a plague. You catch phrases like family ruin and moral decay, each syllable sharp as a church bell. The mainstream fact: by the 1890s, the French bourgeoisie had declared open war on absinthe. They saw it as the symbol of decadence, idleness, and the erosion of traditional values. Campaigns against it cropped up in newspapers, at pulpits, and even in Parliament. The middle classes, who prided themselves on sobriety and order, watched with alarm as café terraces teemed with noisy drinkers, women sipping openly, and artists turning intoxication into a badge of honor. You notice a group of men passing pamphlets. One flyer shows a skeletal hand clutching a glass, the caption warning that every sip brings you closer to death. Another depicts a mother ignoring her children as she stares blankly at her absinthe, food burning on the stove. These are the horror stories of the day, illustrations meant to jolt the conscience and stir guilt. Historians still argue whether such propaganda reflected genuine health concerns or a broader fear of social change creeping into Parisian life. Quirky tidbit. Some campaigns tried to get creative, insisting absinthe turned drinkers green, skin, eyes, even their souls. The logic was as cloudy as the drink itself, but the rumor spread. Imagine someone telling you your latte might tint you beige forever. It's absurd, but gossip thrives on absurdity. You stand by as the preacher's voice rises. He points a trembling finger toward the cafes glowing across the street. He describes them as dens of vice, places where fortunes are lost, reputations ruined, and entire families torn apart. His audience murmurs agreement, though you catch one man at the edge of the crowd sneaking a sip from a flask hidden in his coat pocket. The irony almost makes you chuckle. The bourgeois backlash isn't just sermons, though. Politicians begin drafting restrictions, limiting hours of sale, or raising taxes on absinthe. Some neighborhoods petition to close cafes entirely. Reformers align with the struggling wine industry, both groups eager to restore the grape's rightful place at the French table. You can almost hear the vineyard owners clapping from the shadows, grateful for every pamphlet that paints absinthe as the devil's brew. Here's your light joke. Imagine being so outraged by other people's drinking habits that you invent a whole marketing campaign for not drinking. It's the 19th century version of someone posting 20 angry Facebook statuses about how much they hate social media. Still, the backlash makes an impression. Respectable families begin to treat absinthe as a lower-class indulgence, a sign of weakness, or moral failure. It becomes fashionable in some circles to sneer at the fairy, to whisper about ruined households, to warn children never to touch the green liquid. Yet paradoxically, the bans and condemnations only make it more alluring. The forbidden always glitters brighter under lamplight. You drift away from the square, the preacher's voice fading behind you, but his warnings linger. On one side of Paris, the fairy dances across posters, alluring and playful. On the other, she's painted as a monster, threatening to devour society. The truth, as always, swirls somewhere in between, as cloudy and elusive as the drink itself. Your path carries you past the glow of the cafes, through the narrow veins of Paris, and into the shadow of a military barracks. The sound here is not piano keys or drunken chatter, but the sharp clatter of boots on cobblestones, the metallic rhythm of discipline. Yet even here, the green fairy finds her place. Soldiers file into the mess hall, tin cups clanging against the counter as a ladle dips into a cask. The liquid sloshes pale and sharp. Absinthe, rationed as casually as bread or cheese. The mainstream fact: absinthe was part of the French army's standard issue in the 19th century, particularly after France's colonial campaigns in North Africa. Mixed with water, it wasn't just for morale, it doubled as a disinfectant for drinking water, killing off bacteria in questionable supplies. By the 1890s, countless veterans returned home with a taste for it, spreading the fairies. Reach from battlefield to boulevard. The ritual is simpler here than in the cafes. No fancy sugar spoons or slow drips of water. Just a splash into a cup, maybe a quick dilution, and down it goes. Efficiency over elegance. Yet you sense a camaraderie in the way soldiers clink their cups, laughing about campaigns long past, telling stories louder with each swallow. Absinthe isn't just a ration, it's a bond. A quirky tidbit slips in. Soldiers jokingly nicknamed the drink la bleue, the blue one, not because of its color, but as a kind of inside joke. In some regiments, men claimed absinthe made them fearless, while others swore it made the enemy look green and monstrous. Whether courage or hallucination, the line blurred under the desert sun. Historians still argue whether absinthe gave soldiers strength or simply dulled their misery enough to keep marching. You picture a young recruit shivering during a night watch, steadying his nerves with a gulp from his ration. Another, wounded and weary, is offered a sip as crude medicine. The fairy becomes a constant presence, woven into the soldier's life like the smell of gunpowder or the weight of the uniform. Still, not all the military were fans. Some officers complained of drunkenness undermining discipline. Reports of soldiers stumbling during drills or brawling in barracks began to pile up. One exasperated general allegedly muttered that absinthe was as dangerous to the army as any enemy. Imagine explaining to your boss that you missed work not because of illness, but because your fairy friend kept you up too late. It's a defense unlikely to earn sympathy. Yet, for all the complaints, the fairy marched with the troops. Veterans returned from service, craving the drink they'd come to depend on, and soon their families and neighbors followed suit. The army unintentionally acted as an ambassador, spreading the fairy's legend far beyond Paris into provincial towns and remote villages. As you linger near the barracks, you catch a group of soldiers heading into town for their evening leave. Where do they go? Straight to the nearest café, cups waiting, posters smiling down, rituals ready to begin. The line between military ration and Parisian craze has blurred completely. Absinthe belongs equally to the battlefield and the boulevard. The fairy is adaptable like that, whether dressed in sugar and ceremony or ladled out of a barrel in a dusty camp, she always finds her way into the glass. You drift back toward the café districts, where the noise sharpens into a steady hum of politics. Tonight, the fairy isn't just lubricating conversations about art and love, she's fueling debates about the nation itself. Around each small wooden table, arguments erupt and settle, only to flare up again, punctuated by the clink of spoons and the hiss of water hitting absinthe. You lean against the wall and eavesdrop, letting the tide of voices wash over you. The mainstream fact: the 1890s in France were marked by political upheaval. The wounds of the Franco-Prussian War lingered, the Dreyfus affair was splitting society down the middle, and the Third Republic struggled to find its footing. In this tense atmosphere, cafés became not just social hubs, but informal parliaments. Absinthe was their unofficial drink of debate, the companion to heated arguments over justice, identity, and the soul of the nation. You picture one corner, table where a cluster of students argue about socialism, their words spilling as quickly as their drinks. At another, grey-haired veterans defend their honor, slamming cups for emphasis. A journalist scribbles in the corner, turning overheard shouts into tomorrow's editorial. The fairy flits invisibly between them, loosening tongues, softening inhibitions, encouraging bold claims that might not survive the sobriety of morning. Quirky tidbit: some radical groups even staged absinthe meetings, deliberately gathering over the green drink as a symbol of rebellion against bourgeois respectability. To them, wine was tied to the church and tradition, but absinthe was modern, defiant, even dangerous. Historians still argue whether the fairy truly influenced politics or if she was simply the witness, present wherever debates were loudest and tempers hottest. A man slams his fist, shouting about liberty. Another waves his spoon like a conductor's baton, insisting on justice. The debates grow rowdier, but they rarely end in violence, more often in laughter, toasts, or exaggerated sighs of defeat. Absinthe isn't just fueling words, it's cushioning them, transforming sharp edges into hazy blurs. Here's a light joke for you. If Twitter had existed in 1890s Paris, half the trending topics would have been written under the influence of absinthe, half-baked threads ending with, "Sorry, had too much fairy tonight." You watch as a woman in a tailored dress joins a debate, her presence met with both admiration and unease. The fairy has opened doors for women too, allowing them into public conversations once dominated by men. Her glass gleams under the gaslight, a subtle rebellion all on its own. By midnight, the square hums like a hive, each café its own buzzing cell. Arguments drift into the street, overlapping into a chorus of voices. You realize the fairy isn't just in the glass, she's in the air woven into the very rhythm of political life. Absinthe, once a soldier's ration and an artist's muse, now doubles as a politician's spark, a citizen's courage, a protester's shield. And though the outcomes of these debates remain uncertain, one thing is clear. Without the fairy, Parisian politics would have been a much quieter affair. The night stretches long, but Paris shows no sign of quieting. You follow the sound of fiddles and laughter into a sprawling dance hall where the air is humid with sweat, perfume, and spilled drink. This isn't the refined world of literary cafés or political debates. It's the realm of cheap tickets, crowded floors, and a green fairy poured fast and rough. Here, absinthe belongs to the working class, the labourers who've clocked out from endless shifts and now demand a taste of escape. The mainstream fact: by the late 19th century, absinthe was no longer a luxury for soldiers and artists alone. Industrialization had driven down costs, and distillers churned out cheaper versions, often with questionable ingredients. Working-class Parisians embraced it as the affordable indulgence, stronger than wine and easier to find in neighborhood bars. Consumption soared so dramatically that by 1910, France was drinking 36 million litres a year. In the dance hall, men in rolled-up sleeves slam their cups back in one swallow, while women with tired eyes stretch their smiles into something resembling freedom. A fiddler scrapes out a tune, and couples whirl clumsily, laughing too loudly, knocking into tables without apology. The fairy, unbothered by elegance, dances right along with them. Quirky tidbit: some distillers cut corners by using copper sulfate to mimic absinthe's signature green color, which, is great if you're painting a fence, not so great if you're drinking it. People joked, or half-joked, that the fairy was turning into a poisoner in disguise. Historians still argue whether the rise of cheap absinthe caused the health problems blamed on the drink, or whether critics exaggerated dangers to push a moral agenda. You notice a brawl break out near the bar, a couple of men arguing. Over cards, fists flying before anyone can intervene. The bartender sighs, tosses a bucket of water over them, and goes right back to serving. Scenes like this fed the bourgeois narrative. Absinthe wasn't just intoxicating. It was corrupting the lower classes, threatening social order. But to the men and women here, the fairy is simply their nightly reprieve, a chance to numb aching bodies and forget long shifts at the factory. For comic relief, picture this. If modern happy hour gave out drinks as strong as absinthe for the price of a baguette, offices everywhere would empty by 3 p.m, and productivity would flatline faster than you can say Green Fairy Special. Still, there's a tenderness woven into the rough edges. A young couple leans close over a shared glass, whispering secrets. Friends toast to small victories, a pay raise, a day off, a safe return from illness. In the glow of the fairy, hardship softens, even if only for an hour. As you leave the dance hall, the sound of fiddles still buzzing in your ears, you realize the fairy has woven herself into every layer of society. From the polished spoon rituals of the elite to the rough and ready cups of the working poor, she is everywhere, slipping easily from one hand to the next. Paris may be divided by wealth and class, but in the swirl of a green drink, the city feels united, if only for a fleeting moment. Your walk carries you back outside, where the night air has cooled, but Paris still hums with its restless heartbeat. The glow of cafés and bars spills onto the streets, and you catch snatches of conversations, this time not about politics or poetry, but about something darker. Health. People are beginning to murmur that the fairy, once charming and liberating, might actually be killing them. The mainstream fact: by the late 19th century, medical journals and newspapers were filled with alarming reports of absinthism, a supposed chronic condition caused by long-term absinthe drinking. Symptoms included convulsions, hallucinations, violent outbursts, and, most dramatically, madness. Doctors described case studies of patients who swore insects crawled under their skin or who collapsed into seizures after a single glass. Whether these were truly unique to absinthe or simply the effects of heavy alcohol consumption, the stories caught fire in the public imagination. One infamous incident you overhear is the Lanfray affair. In 1905, a Swiss laborer named Jean Lanfray murdered his family after a day of heavy drinking. While he had consumed multiple types of alcohol, wine, brandy, and more, it was the 2 glasses of absinthe that grabbed the headlines. Soon, absinthe was portrayed not as a drink, but as a villain in itself, a sinister instigator of crime and moral decay. Quirky tidbit. Anti-absinthe campaigners sometimes displayed jars with preserved brains, claiming they belonged to absinthe drinkers whose grey matter had been corroded into green mush. You'd think someone would notice that brains don't actually turn green, but details like that rarely ruin a good scare story. Historians still argue whether absinthe had unique toxic effects due to its compound thujone, or whether the panic was exaggerated by the temperance movement and wine lobby. In one cafe, you see a patron swearing he saw tiny demons dancing on the table after his third glass. His friends laugh, calling it imagination, but another man mutters that he's heard the same. A woman nervously touches her arm, insisting she feels invisible bugs crawling there. The fairy, once playful, is being reimagined as sinister. No longer a muse, but a tormentor. Even the posters shift tone. Where once the green fairy appeared coquettish and inviting, now caricatures show her as skeletal, dragging men into madness. Newspapers print cautionary tales of once stable workers ruined by the drink, their families left in poverty. Absinthe becomes not just a social issue, but a moral panic, the target of public crusades. For comic relief, you imagine modern public health campaigns with the same flair. Instead of drink responsibly, billboards might show your favorite cocktail morphing into a demon gnawing your shoelaces. Subtlety was not the strong suit of fin de siècle propaganda. And yet, as you glance at the glass in your own hand, you wonder how much is myth and how much is real. The fairy sparkles the same as ever, innocent in appearance, seductive in her glow. Is she truly a poisoner, or just the scapegoat for society's unease? The question lingers like a bitter aftertaste, unsettled, unanswered. You drift onward, carried by the pulse of the city, until you find yourself at the edges of a laboratory. It isn't glamorous, like the cafés or cabarets. It smells of alcohol, chalk, and dust. But here the fairy undergoes her sternest scrutiny. Scientists, doctors, and politicians lean over benches, peering into glass tubes filled with emerald liquid, convinced they are dissecting the source of Paris's anxieties. The mainstream fact: researchers of the late 19th century fixated on one compound in absinthe, thujone, a chemical found in wormwood. In laboratory studies, pure thujone was shown to cause convulsions in animals. From this came the claim that absinthe uniquely attacked the nervous system, producing seizures, hallucinations, and insanity, effects supposedly distinct from ordinary alcohol. The logic wasn't flawless. These experiments involved far higher doses of thujone than anyone would ever sip in a cafe, but fear travels faster than nuance. You picture one earnest doctor waving a test tube like it's Exhibit A, declaring triumphantly that the fairy's wings are dipped in poison. Another scribbles diagrams of neurons, trying to show how the compound hijacks the brain. Meanwhile, critics point out that no drinker downs pure wormwood oil at dinner. They sip diluted absinthe mixed with sugar and water. Historians still argue whether typical 1890s absinthe contained enough thujone to matter, or whether the scare was inflated by vested interests. Quirky tidbit. In one case, a doctor attempted to measure thujone's effect by injecting it straight into frogs. The frogs did indeed convulse. But frankly, most creatures would if you jabbed them with random plant oils. Still, the spectacle made for convincing evidence in pamphlets warning the public of absinthe's dangers. You wander past stacks of pamphlets, each with dramatic titles: The Green Curse, Death in a Glass, The Madness of the Fairy. The language is sensational, almost theatrical. Paris, once enchanted by absinthe's glamour, is being persuaded to fear her instead. Yet even here, hints of irony slip in. A chemist mutters that wine contains other compounds in higher doses, yet no one dares call Bordeaux a national threat. The thought lingers. Perhaps the fairy is being framed, not for her true chemical sins, but for her symbolic power. Too bohemian, too unruly, too associated with women, artists, and outsiders. For a quick laugh, you imagine if scientists today tried to ban energy drinks by injecting caffeine directly into rats. See, "Look, the rat's vibrating. Proof your latte will kill you." Some debates never change, just the substances involved. As the gaslights flicker low in the lab, you sense a shift in the city's mood. The fairy who once symbolized creativity and freedom now stands accused of poisoning minds and rotting society. Her trial isn't happening in a courtroom yet, but in the laboratories and newspapers where fact, fear, and politics mingle as messily as any cafe cocktail. You slip back into the streets, where the night air tastes different now. Less of wonder, more of suspicion. The fairy is still being poured in cafes and bars, but whispers trail her like shadows. Doctors warn, newspapers scold, and pamphlets circulate with lurid illustrations. The city that once embraced her as muse and companion is slowly turning against her. The mainstream fact: beginning in the 1890s, anti-absinthe leagues formed across France, Switzerland, and beyond. These groups weren't casual hobbyists. They lobbied governments, printed posters, and delivered fiery speeches about how the Green Fairy was destroying families, wrecking workers' health, and leading good citizens into crime. Their arguments often dovetailed with the broader temperance movement, which already sought to reduce alcohol consumption. But absinthe, with its mystique and striking color, made a perfect target. Quirky tidbit. Some campaigners staged theatrical demonstrations where actors played drunkards possessed by absinthe. They staggered, shouted nonsense, and collapsed, on cue, leaving audiences horrified or quietly amused. Imagine today's anti-smoking ads if they hired performers to keel over dramatically in shopping malls. Effective? Maybe. Entertaining? Definitely. Historians still argue whether these crusades reflected genuine health concerns or whether they were driven more by politics and economics. Wine producers, still recovering from the phylloxera epidemic that devastated vineyards, had plenty of incentive to smear absinthe. After all, if the public could be convinced the green drink was deadly, perhaps red and white wines could reclaim their dominance. As you stroll past posters plastered to a wall, the images startle you. One shows the fairy as a gaunt spectre clutching a skull, another depicts her dragging a man into a pit while his family weeps. Subtlety, clearly, was not on the agenda. To the middle classes, these images confirmed what they feared. The working poor weren't just drinking, they were being corrupted by a demonic influence. Inside a cafe, you overhear a conversation between two patrons. One man insists absinthe is the only drink strong enough to soothe his aching bones after factory shifts. The other shakes his head, muttering that his brother lost his job because of it. For them, it isn't a theoretical debate. It's survival versus ruin, played out one glass at a time. For comic relief, imagine if your morning coffee was suddenly accused of turning you into a criminal mastermind. Breaking news: office worker commits tax fraud after 3 cappuccinos. It sounds ridiculous, but for absinthe, this was the level of public panic. Walking away, you realize the fairy has become more than a drink. She is a battleground. To her supporters, she's a necessary comfort, even a source of inspiration. To her enemies, she's a corrupting demon, dragging society into decay. The green glow still shines in the glasses of Paris, but it flickers now with uncertainty, as if the city itself isn't sure whether to raise a toast or an accusation. You keep wandering, and soon the streets carry you past a courthouse, where the air is tense, almost theatrical. Here, the debate over absinthe isn't confined to cafe chatter or medical lectures. It's being hammered into law. The Green Fairy has stepped into the dock, accused of crimes she may or may not have committed. The mainstream fact: across Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, parliaments and local councils debated bans or heavy restrictions on absinthe. Switzerland became the epicenter after the infamous 1905 Lanfray murders, where newspapers claimed absinthe alone had driven a man to kill his family. Though he had consumed plenty of wine and brandy as well, absinthe took the blame. The case sparked petitions demanding a ban, and within years, several regions outlawed it entirely. Quirky tidbit: some anti-absinthe activists staged mock trials in town squares, complete with actors playing the fairy, judges in robes, and crowds cheering, as the criminal was sentenced. Imagine an outdoor play where the villain is a bottle of liquor with painted eyes. Audiences loved the drama, even if it blurred the line between fact and performance. Historians still argue whether these bans were motivated more by morality or economics. Was absinthe genuinely seen as a public health menace, or was it too convenient? A scapegoat for governments eager to appear protective and wine growers eager to regain dominance. The truth, as usual, probably swirls somewhere in between. As you lean against a pillar, you hear a lawyer pacing and proclaiming to the jury, "Absinthe does not intoxicate like wine, it poisons." He waves his hand like a conductor. The gallery murmurs in approval. Yet in the corridors, a clerk whispers that his uncle still drinks it every day, perfectly fine, except for the occasional headache. For comic relief, you imagine what the fairies. Defense attorney might have said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client is merely a beverage. Can a drink hold a knife? Can a liquid form intent?" At worst, she may cause questionable dance moves, but that is hardly criminal. You almost want to applaud. Back outside, crowds gather around the courthouse steps. Some cheer the prospect of a ban, shouting that their children will be safer. Others grumble that the government is meddling in their pleasures. Paris is divided, and the fairy, once adored by poets and painters, now hangs precariously between outlaw and outcast. The city's glow feels dimmer, as though the very gas lamps are uncertain. Should they illuminate her emerald sparkle, or let her fade into shadow? You drift away from the courthouse and find yourself at the gates of a factory. Inside, the fairy is not a whimsical muse, but a commodity, boiled, distilled, bottled, and shipped. Workers in aprons bustle about, stirring vats that smell sharply, of anise and herbs. Here, absinthe isn't poetry, it's production. The mainstream fact: by the 1890s, absinthe had become a massive industry in France and Switzerland. Large distilleries like Pernod-Ricard churned out millions of liters a year, exporting bottles across Europe and even to the United States. In Paris, entire streets were lined with cafés offering l'heure verte, and suppliers couldn't keep up with demand. Absinthe wasn't just a fad, it was a major economic force. Quirky tidbit: some cheaper distillers, desperate to cash in, cut corners by using copper salts to intensify the drink's green color. The result was a toxic brew that really could sicken or kill unlucky drinkers. Honest producers protested, but the damage was done. Rumors spread that all absinthe was adulterated, adding fuel to the anti-absinthe fire. Historians still argue whether the popularity of these cheaper, more dangerous brands explains absinthe's terrible reputation. Was the fairy herself to blame, or the shady businessman who dressed her up with artificial sparkle? The question lingers, like the metallic tang of counterfeit spirits. You picture the factory floor. Barrels stacked high, workers coughing in. The steam, labels being glued onto glass with repetitive, weary motions. Some bottles gleam proudly with the Pernod seal, symbols of quality. Others, less scrupulous, are destined for dingier markets, where customers won't notice the difference until it's too late. A supervisor paces through the rows, muttering about quotas, while outside, wagons line up to carry crates across the city. The fairy may appear ethereal in a painter's studio, but here she is pure commerce, measured in profit margins, wages, and exports. For comic relief, imagine if today's hipster craft breweries suddenly exploded into mega factories, pumping out artisanal pumpkin chai IPA by the barrel. The fairy, too, lost some of her handmade charm when she went industrial. But hey, at least she never had to deal with seasonal pumpkin spice. As you leave the factory, the mood shifts again. Behind the humming machinery lies a paradox. The very success that made absinthe a household name also made her a convenient target. The more money she generated, the more enemies she attracted, critics eager to claim that her green glow was just a painted mask hiding poison. The fairy's story is no longer confined to smoky cafés or artist garrets. She has become a creature of the marketplace, caught in the gears of industry, and her fate is now tied to economics as much as romance. You wander from the factories toward the quieter streets, where voices are hushed and curtains drawn. Here, The fairy is not celebrated on cafe tables or courtroom steps. She lurks in back rooms and kitchens, poured in secrecy. The bans may not yet be universal, but suspicion already drives some drinkers underground, where absinthe takes on a new identity. The mainstream fact: even before outright prohibitions, many regions began restricting absinthe sales. Some cafes quietly reduced their menus, while others disguised the drink behind vague descriptions. Later, when bans became official, bootlegging and black market production flourished. People distilled absinthe in sheds, basements, and farms, creating a parallel economy that mirrored Prohibition-era America decades later. Quirky tidbit: clandestine recipes often recycled whatever herbs and spirits were available. Some batches included ingredients like hyssop or even nettles, lending flavors far from the refined versions of Pernod. In a way, every illicit bottle was its own experiment, part medicine, part gamble, part dare. Drinkers joked that you didn't sip these. Homemade brews, you challenged them. Historians still argue whether the underground absinthe trade kept the fairy's legend alive or tarnished it further. Did the secrecy preserve her allure like a forbidden fruit, or did the rough flavors and occasional poisonings cement her reputation as dangerous? Both views echo in the record, never quite reconciled. In a cramped kitchen, you picture a man carefully pouring liquid from a jar into a reused wine bottle, listening for footsteps outside. His friends huddle around, anxious but excited, as though they're part of a private ritual. Each glass becomes an act of defiance, a statement that the fairy cannot be legislated out of existence. For comic relief, imagine a neighbor complaining, not about the smell of strong spirits, but about the terrible accordion practice drifting through the window. In that moment, maybe the fairy was the lesser of two evils. As you continue, you see chalk scrawls on a wall, a crude drawing of a green fairy with wings and shackles. Even in secrecy, her image persists, scribbled like graffiti in the margins of the city. By the time you reach the riverbank, you realize that the bans didn't extinguish her. They only forced her into the shadows. And there, in those dim alleys and hidden rooms, her mystique may have grown stronger than ever. You step away from the alleyways of secret kitchens and into the world of medicine, where the fairy takes on yet another costume. Once a symbol of bohemian freedom, she is now dressed up in a doctor's coat, or at least in the marketing of one. The mainstream fact: during the 19th century, absinthe was often prescribed as a tonic. Physicians recommended it for digestion, fevers, menstrual pain, and even as a preventative against malaria. In colonial outposts, French soldiers were given absinthe rations partly because wormwood was thought to ward off disease. By the 1890s, these medicinal justifications had become a crucial part of absinthe's survival, even as the moral panic against it grew. Quirky tidbit: advertisements sometimes depicted absinthe bottles alongside syringes, bandages, or doctors with impressive mustaches, giving the impression that this was less a drink than a cure-all. One campaign even suggested it sharpened the mind, as though drinking a glass was the equivalent of a college education. If only student loans worked that way. Historians still argue whether doctors genuinely believed in absinthe's therapeutic properties, or whether it was simply another case of medical endorsement chasing popularity. After all, this was the same era, when heroin and cocaine were marketed as household remedies. The line between pharmacy and indulgence was paper-thin, and absinthe danced merrily along it. In a dim dispensary, you imagine rows of glass jars filled with dried herbs, scales for careful measurements, and a physician slipping a small bottle across the counter with a wink. The patient walks away believing they've received medicine, though whether their symptoms improve depends more on alcohol content than mystical cures. For comic relief, picture today's pharmaceutical ads, but instead of people jogging on beaches, it's a Parisian artist sketching wildly after 3 glasses with the tagline, "Ask your doctor if hallucinations are right for you." Side effects may include poetry, questionable fashion, and a tendency to stare at gas lamps. The medicinal aura gave absinthe a strange double life. To the authorities, she was a menace, to some doctors, a remedy, and for the everyday drinker, that contradiction offered just enough excuse to raise another glass. After all, if the fairy was medicine, wasn't it almost irresponsible not to drink? You step out of the apothecary haze and back into the world of print. Because if the fairy lived in glass and whispers, she also lived on paper. Newspapers, pamphlets, caricatures, and posters all carried her image, shaping how the public thought about her. The mainstream fact. The late 19th century was an explosion of mass print culture. Absinthe appeared constantly in satirical cartoons, sometimes as a seductive green woman luring men to ruin, other times as a skeletal demon clutching bottles. The illustrated press turned her into a character as recognizable as Marianne, the French symbol of liberty, but darker and more ambiguous. Quirky tidbit. One cartoon depicted a courtroom where the judge, jury, and executioner were all bottles of absinthe, an entire justice system staffed by liquor. Another showed a man embracing a green-skinned fairy while his family wept in the background. These exaggerated drawings weren't subtle, but they stuck in the imagination like modern-day memes. Historians still argue whether these caricatures reflected genuine public fear or whether they manufactured it. Did readers already believe absinthe was dangerous, or did the endless stream of cautionary images slowly plant the idea in their minds? Like today's social media debates, the line between echo and origin is hard to pin down. As you walk past a kiosk, you see posters tacked to the walls, brilliantly colored lithographs advertising not just absinthe, but entire lifestyles. One shows elegant women at a cafe, their glasses glowing like jewels. Another sells the fairy with promises of sophistication, almost aristocratic refinement. The contrast is dizzying. One poster makes her a poison, the next a passport to glamour. 4. Comic relief. Imagine if every modern drink were personified the way absinthe was. A beer commercial with a hulking, foamy ogre. A soda poster with a jittery sprite who won't stop bouncing. Coffee, of course, would be a vampire who only comes out at sunrise. Absinthe's fairy might actually prefer that company. The paper world makes her feel immortal. Every day, new sheets are printed, scattered, read and discarded, yet her figure survives, reproduced endlessly. On the street corner, she is no longer just a drink. She is ink, image, and imagination, etched into the collective mind of Paris, whether people toast her or tear her down. From the kiosks plastered with caricatures, you drift toward the cabarets of Montmartre, where the fairy is neither medicine nor menace, but a performer in her own right. Music and laughter pour out of basement doors, the air thick with smoke and the clink of glasses. Here, you see how absinthe carved out a stage presence in the nightlife of Paris. The mainstream fact. Cabarets like Le Chat Noir and the Moulin Rouge were central to 1890s Parisian entertainment. Absinthe was often the drink of choice at these venues, woven into the nightly routines of song, satire, and spectacle. Performers sometimes referenced the Green Fairy directly in their acts, knowing the crowd would understand the joke. Quirky tidbit. One cabaret featured a mechanical shadow play where a tiny green fairy figure danced across the wall, projected by lantern. Another had a house drink called La Muse Verte, poured theatrically as if it were part of the show. Patrons treated ordering absinthe less like buying a beverage and more like participating in a performance. Historians still argue whether the cabaret's embrace of absinthe helped popularize it further or accelerated its downfall. Was the fairy's presence in rowdy entertainment proof of her cultural power, or did it strengthen the association with debauchery? The debate lingers like a chorus line that refuses to leave the stage. You picture yourself in the crowded room, can-can dancers kicking in rhythm, musicians playing frenzied chords, and patrons raising their glasses in a synchronized cheer. The fairy hovers over the whole spectacle, equal parts muse and mischief maker. She is both the rhythm of the piano and the dizziness in your step when you try to dance along. For comic relief, imagine the poor waiter trying to carry 10 delicate glasses of absinthe through the chaos of the dance floor. One wrong step, and suddenly the fairy becomes slapstick, slipping everyone into a green-tinted puddle. In this world of lights, shadows, and laughter, you realize the fairy is more than a drink. She is part of the script, a character in the cabaret's nightly drama. And when the curtain falls, she follows the audience home, still humming in their ears like the echo of a final song. You wander away from the cabaret's music and laughter into a quieter corner of Paris life, the small kitchens and parlour rooms where families debate whether to banish the green fairy from their homes. The controversy, once confined to artists and doctors, now seeps into the domestic sphere. The mainstream fact. By the 1890s, absinthe accounted for a staggering portion of alcohol consumption in France, millions of litres each year. This made it not just a social curiosity, but an everyday household issue. Families argued at dinner tables, temperance groups held rallies, and wives petitioned authorities, claiming absinthe destroyed homes as much as it did livers. Quirky tidbit. In some towns, women organised absinthe funerals, mock ceremonies where they buried bottles in the ground with solemn hymns as though exorcising a demon. Children were sometimes recruited to march in little processions, waving banners that declared, "Down with the green fairy." One can only imagine the confusion of a 7-year-old enlisted to battle an imaginary sprite. Historians still argue whether these grassroots movements truly swayed government policy or whether they were symbolic gestures drowned out by the drink's popularity. Was the fairy's decline caused by moral outcry or by broader economic and political currents that simply used temperance as a convenient excuse? In a cramped tenement room, you imagine a mother hiding her husband's absinthe glass behind the bread box while he searches the cupboards muttering curses. In a wealthier salon, a hostess might quietly serve it only to certain guests, fearing scandal if the wrong neighbour noticed. The fairy's presence created fissures between classes, genders, even generations. For comic relief, picture the absurdity of a teenager sneaking out not for cigarettes, but to score a nip of absinthe behind. The bakery, trying to look tough while gagging on wormwood bitterness. The rebellious glamour probably wore off halfway through the first sip. The fairy was no longer just a café indulgence or an artistic muse. She had become a domestic problem, a household ghost lingering in kitchens and parlours, forcing families to choose between loyalty to tradition and the growing chorus demanding her exile. The household quarrels fade into something larger, the slow tightening of political knots around the fairy's wings. By the late 1890s, the conversation about absinthe had leapt from kitchens and cafes into parliamentary chambers, where legislators debated whether this emerald muse was a national treasure or a national curse. The mainstream fact. By the turn of the century, France's government began seriously considering restrictions on absinthe, pushed by doctors, temperance advocates, and especially the wine industry. With vineyards recovering from the devastating phylloxera blight, winemakers wanted absinthe curtailed so their product could reclaim dominance. Absinthe, they argued, wasn't just unhealthy, it was an economic rival. Quirky tidbit. Some politicians staged dramatic speeches holding up glasses of cloudy absinthe water as if brandishing poison. One eccentric deputy even suggested training parrots to repeat anti-absinthe slogans so that tavern-goers would hear constant reminders from cages hanging in cafes. The proposal never passed, though you can almost imagine birds squawking, "Down with the fairy," over the clink of glasses. Historians still argue whether the impending ban was truly about public health or about protecting the struggling wine industry. Was the green fairy targeted because she was dangerous or because she was too successful? The question lingers in academic circles like a glass left unfinished on a counter. You picture yourself in a stuffy parliamentary gallery, the air buzzing with heated words. One speaker thunders about broken families and wasted lives. Another counters with statistics about jobs, trade, and culture. The fairy herself, invisible but felt, hovers above the room like an uninvited witness to her own trial. For comic relief, imagine the poor stenographer, tasked with recording these sessions, trying to keep a straight face as politicians argued, over fairy hallucinations and parrots as propaganda. That transcript must have read like a half-finished vaudeville script. The whispers of ban and regulation grew louder, not yet law, but already shaping public perception. The fairy, who once seemed untouchable in her glittering cafes, now found herself entangled in bureaucracy, dragged from smoky back rooms into the harsh light of national politics. The debates crescendo, and you feel the fairy's wings faltering under the weight of scrutiny. By the end of the 1890s, the once unstoppable tide of emerald liquid begins to ebb. France has not yet outlawed absinthe. That comes in the early 20th century, but the seeds of her downfall are firmly planted. The mainstream fact, medical reports, temperance propaganda, and parliamentary sessions had shifted public opinion. By the century's turn, absinthe was increasingly framed not as a drink of sophistication, but as a social menace. By 1900, several countries, including Belgium and Switzerland, were already discussing restrictions, foreshadowing France's eventual ban in 1915. Quirky tidbit. Some bars, sensing the winds changing, rebranded their drinks with sly euphemisms. Patrons were offered the Emerald Cordial or La Muse Verte, as if saying the name aloud might summon police. One particularly cheeky café renamed Absinthe Parliamentary Water, guaranteeing nervous laughter with every order. Historians still argue whether absinthe truly deserved the demonization it received. Modern studies suggest the drink's effects were largely those of strong alcohol, not hallucinations from wormwood. Was the fairy ever truly dangerous, or was she a scapegoat, sacrificed for politics and profit? That uncertainty keeps scholars poring over old data like bartenders endlessly refilling glasses. You imagine walking through Paris in 1899. Cafés still serve the fairy, though with a touch of defiance, as though each glass is a protest against the future. Posters still shimmer on walls, though their colors seem a little faded. In Montmartre, artists still paint and drink, but whispers of prohibition hover like storm clouds. The fairy hasn't vanished, but she carries a shadow now. Less muse, more outlaw. For comic relief, picture a Parisian artist sketching the fairy one last time, only to have his landlord scold him. Paint fruit instead, it sells better. He sighs, paints a pear, but gives it tiny wings out of spite. The fairy has reached the end of her glittering decade, poised between glory and decline. You feel the hush of a curtain drawing closed, not with a bang, but with a sigh, the applause fading as the lights dim on her green-hued stage. As the echoes of debate and the clink of glasses fade, you feel the tempo of the night slowing, like music softening after a long dance. The streets of Paris grow quieter, the lanterns casting gentler shadows across cobblestones that moments ago seemed alive with laughter. The fairy, once bright and teasing, now drifts into a haze, her outline blurring until she feels less like a presence and more like a memory. You imagine yourself seated at a café table long after the crowd has left, only the faint hum of a city, settling into slumber surrounding you. The air feels cooler, the scents softer, and even the chatter of distant voices is muffled, like whispers under a blanket. The fairy doesn't leave abruptly. Instead, she fades, step by step, her green glow dimming into a comfortable dusk. Your thoughts begin to stretch out like shadows at twilight, slower, gentler, less insistent. Each breath feels heavier, grounding you, as if the body is preparing itself for rest. Absinthe's story lingers not as drama now, but as a lullaby of clinking glasses, painted posters, and soft laughter in smoky rooms that no longer exist. Historians can debate the truth of her legend forever, but for you, here, the fairy simply becomes a quiet companion, an echo of another time that drifts into silence. The cobblestones fade, the lanterns dim, and the hum of the fan in your own room takes over, steady, soothing, constant. So, as you settle deeper into your pillow, you let the last notes of the green fairy's tale dissolve into calm. The night folds around you, gentle and unhurried, and the story slips softly into sleep.